Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne, and you are listening to The Halli Casser-Jayne Show, available at hallicasserjayne.com. Welcome to The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Let's talk. Today on The Halli Casser-Jayne Show, two conversations that you don't want to miss. Up first, best-selling author Peter Ames Carlin, out with a controversial new book, Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon, the first major biography of the American music icon. And in our second half hour, the legendary author of Forrest Gump, out with his first novel in 20 years, the book El Paso, a read I highly recommend. Winston Groom on The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. But before we begin, The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at hallicasserjayne.com. The first major biography of American music icon Paul Simon has arrived. Interviewing more than 100 people from Simon's world, veteran rock biographer Peter Ames Carlin, the best-selling author of the Bruce Springsteen biography Bruce, brings us the new book, Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon. With meticulous detail, Carlin fully reveals one whose life and career in so many ways exemplifies the American experience from 1950 through today. The grandchild of Jewish immigrants from Hungary, Paul Simon has played significant, often controversial roles in many major cultural and political events of the last 60 years, recording his first record in 1957, just months after Elvis Presley. As the songwriting half of Simon&Garfunkel, Simon's work has helped define the youth movement of the 60s with hits such as The Sound of Silence, Homeward Bound, and Bridge Over Troubled Water. On his own in the 70s, he made radio-dominating hits Kodachrome, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, Still Crazy after all these years. In the 1980s, by reuniting with Garfunkel to perform for 500,000 people in New York Central Park. 5 years later, his album Graceland sold millions and spurred an international political controversy. And just this past June, Simon's latest album, Stranger to Stranger, debuted at number 3 on the Billboard album charts. From Tin Pan Alley to Spotify, by way of the Civil Rights era, to the anti-apartheid movement, the Monterey Pop Festival, to the birth of Saturday Night Live, the explosion of Woody Allen's Annie Hall, to the era-defining soundtrack to The Graduate, the rebirth of the modern Broadway musical, Simon, now 75, stands as the voice of a generation. Here's a look at the boy, the man, the artist, and the businessman, the friend, husband, partner, the adversary, with author Peter Ames Carlin. Let's talk. So, Peter, Paul Frederick Simon, would you define him as a genius or an insufferable plagiarizer or simply insufferable, a delight, or D, all of the above, or just your thoughts on who this guy is?
He's mostly, musically, I think he's a genius. I think that he has his darker parts, and sometimes he'll do some things that probably the rest of us might find regrettable. To some extent, I think he's been a little heavy-handed at times, not often, but rarely and memorably in maybe being a little heavy-handed and taking songwriting credits from people who might deserve to have their names and a certain amount of royalties flowing in their direction as a result of their work on songs. But generally, I mean, you know, how do you not? I mean, Paul. There's almost the incidents of, or at least the allegations of his song swiping are very few and far between, and he's written hundreds and hundreds of songs, and so many of which are standards and sound just like him. So, yeah. But can he also be insufferable? Can he also be prickly and sort of a jerk to people? Yes. Can he also be extraordinarily kind and warm and generous to people? Yes. a very complicated individual.
Let's look into him. He's sold more than 100 million records. That's astonishing. 15 Grammy Awards. He's been inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame not once but twice. How did this little Jewish boy from Queens become this music legend? What happened in his background? Good childhood, bad childhood? Give us something.
Oh, I think it was a great childhood in a lot of ways. His dad, Louis, was a professional musician himself. He played bass and led a dance band, performing under the name Lee Sims, which was standard for people with ethnic kind of names back in those days. You needed to have a pretty flexible identity if you were, an immigrant or a minority of one person, one sort or the other. I think that also he was remarkably talented and intelligent, and also remarkably insecure. Being a very short kid, he didn't like the way that his face looked. He didn't like his hair, and he didn't like, when he became interested in music, he didn't like the way his voice sounded either. And especially after he met Artie Garfunkel and they began to sing together, I think he was extraordinarily conscious of the distinction between Artie's very beautiful sort of golden voice and Paul's much more sort of human-sized voice, even though Paul has a lovely voice in a lot of context.
Okay, so you bring up Art. Let me bring him in here. His partner, listen to how I describe him, his partner in harmony and disharmony. Oh my gosh, right? They met when they were, 11, I think you say. And to my mind, and I want to ask you this, it's like the ghost in Simon's Dark Attic, Art Garfunkel. Talk to us, talk about that and how you think broadly that affected Paul's career.
Sure. Well, they met when they were school kids. They became close when they were 11 and started singing together in this very kind of, obsessive way. I mean, they were both determined, I think, to become professional musicians from a very early age and obsessed over the radio and pop stuff. And they scored their first hit, really. They wrote a song and sang it together called Hey Schoolgirl in the Second Row. And in the fall of 57, when they were both about to be seniors in high school, they managed to sell it to a small record company that put it out and made a pretty decent sized hit out of it. But at the same time, Paul sort of secretly, without Artie's or Artie's parents' knowledge, he and his father hammered out a side deal for him to have a solo career with the same record company. And Artie was enormously hurt by that, and that's kind of the original sin in their relationship. And put that together with the fact that they're both enormously intelligent, independent, and insecure people who are extremely ambitious. It's just, they're like brothers who are constantly at each other's throats. But the depth of their connection and their love for one another, I think, is just as obvious and just as prevalent in their relationship.
So in your mind, what is the major, not musically, but emotionally, what's the major contribution that Artie made to Paul?
I think in those early days, he gave Paul the confidence to really become the artist, that he needed to become. Paul, even though Paul had some success as a solo singer and folk singer in England and London in the early mid-'60s, even as when he was back home, he was working with Artie and they were working on their Simon and Garfunkel material. But Artie really, when it came to taking on the toppermost of the poppermost, as John Lennon would put it, I think that Artie's good looks, his golden hair, his beautiful voice, and just the moral support of having your best friend beside you when you're off, trying to take over the world with your music. I think that was hugely significant for Paul. And when they went their separate ways after Bridge Over Troubled Water, it was traumatic for him to think about how he could possibly have a career without Artie. And it took him a little time, and he managed to figure out how to do it. But again, you can imagine the dependence and the resentment for having to feel that dependence.
Yeah, right. And that seems to be a theme in a way in his life and how in his attachments to other people. We'll talk about that in a second. I've got to ask you, did you go into this liking him, not having an opinion on him, seeking an opinion about him, come out with something new, something different for yourself? What was the experience for you as the writer?
Well, I went into it, with a very deep knowledge of his career. I'd followed him since I was a little kid, and especially as I got older and really had a chance to collect his records and understand them in sort of the larger context of cultural and social history. And really figure out exactly, what his intentions were and how he fit in, and and where he succeeded and where he failed. I knew I was going to be cracking open an extraordinarily complicated guy. I know we have some friends in common, and so I'd heard a lot about him through their impressions, and had read so much about him. And as I began to study him, that all got deepened. Yeah, very complicated guy. Did some stuff that I would never do, that I think is unethical or even borderline immoral at times. On the other hand, has done wonderful things for people. There are people who break into tears when they talk about the kindnesses that Paul has done for them over the years. And so he's a complicated and often tortured soul. It was no surprise to me, but I ended up again, as I've done with a lot of musicians I write about, writing quite a bit about depression and how that manifests in an artist, and how you try to work your way through it. And Paul has had a lot of struggles with that. And and he wears that on his sleeve a lot of the time. So,
I want to make reference to something that we've been talking about, because the first question and now this, it comes up about possibly he having taken other people's riffs and put it into his own music and not given them credit or given them finances to pay them for their work. The New York Daily News headline on its review of your book, startling to me: Paul Simon, biography, Homeward Bound, paints the Graceland rocker as a world-class music thief. Yikes. I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, here's the thing. What the tabloids do, like the Daily News, and then soon after that, the News of the World, was it the News of the World or something in London? Yeah. I can't remember. But, they took stuff out of the book. They took like 4 or 5 different examples and then said world-class music thief. But the problem is, those are 5 examples. There's probably a couple, a handful of pages of material in a book that's like nearly 500 pages long that goes into much deeper, a much deeper context and exactly what was going on and who this guy is and what his kindnesses and generosities are. And, those were like, you can take a handful of sort of dark anecdotes from anyone's life and paint them as horrible people. You could do it to me,
honey, you could do it to us all. Right.
But on the other hand, there's another 50 years of life that I've lived, that I think I've and other things I've done that are way nicer and cooler than me at my worst. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to give you,
worst,
go ahead.
That's a story about Paul at his worst. But the book is about Paul at his most human.
And I thought I'd give you a chance to clear that up, because I had a feeling you were going to give me the answer that I got, and rightfully a good answer. So here's the deal, because when we look at these musicians and these people who have amassed this great, track record and success, all of us want to know what's inside of them that we could maybe grab ourselves onto, that we could make it happen for us too. And you talked about his depression, whatever. I'm curious as to what you think fueled him emotionally. Then I want to ask you what you think fueled him musically. What fueled him? You go for the grab, Peter, for that kind of fame. Something's eating at your butt. Something's nipping at your heels. What do you think it was with him?
Well, I think, there's probably some big hole inside of you that you're trying to fill, some sense of, that you, some sense of something that you're missing inside yourself. And if you work really, really hard and commit yourself and project your whatever creative gifts that you have, and work and work and work, you can maybe make it, you can build a career for yourself. And that's what Paul's done. And like, a certain number of people, particularly of, artists of his generation, he just never stops. Never, ever, ever stops. I mean, and why would he? I mean, being a musician isn't what he is. It's like who he is.
Right.
It's like what his bones and gristle and sap. I mean, it's music. It's all music.
And the music, let me go there. And the music for him being what? Help him figure things out emotionally in the poetry of the song. Maybe for him, the beat is something that helps him clear up something. What's could you figure that out? Did you get to that as to what motivates him musically?
I think he just, it flows through his veins. I mean, I don't even know if he could describe it. I mean, I think it's like heaven to him. It's what makes him feel good. It's what connects him to sort of whatever larger force or God or whatever you want to call it. But when you talk about a guy, and I've heard this from a lot of different songwriters and artists, you get to that moment when you're sitting by yourself alone in your apartment at 2 a.m. and you're playing the guitar, thinking idly of writing a song, and suddenly you hear the melody of Bridge Over Troubled Water, and you feel your hands starting to play the chords on the guitar, and you're humming or singing the song, and suddenly it's like something is falling through you, from the heavens, and coming through you, and it's all you can do to capture it and write it down. And the amazing, I mean, can you imagine the way, how immortal that must make you feel, or how connected to the beauty in the universe you are at that moment.
Yeah, it's amazing. You brought up the Depression. There's the history of the wine, the history with him of wine women's songs. I mean, oh my gosh, I wish we had 2 hours to talk about it. But I want to get to this bottom line. He's 75 years old. Unbelievable. I can't even get there, right? Can you? And he's still making music, but he says he's going to retire after this upcoming European tour. So here's my question. You think he's still crazy after all these years? Or has he found some peace?
Well, I'll tell you what he's not going to do. He's not going to retire. I mean, he's been talking about retiring ever since. I mean, I swear to God, if you go back to his high school newspaper in the February of 1958, he talks about how he and Artie are going to retire from music that fall when they go to college. He said the same thing in 1966. He said the same thing in 75. He said this. I mean, it's just over and over again. He said it again. It's a way for him to get attention. Is he still crazy? He's crazy for music. He's crazy for. He's an artist. I mean, and as Dylan said, you don't look back. You just keep moving, and that's what he is, and I think that's what he'll be till his last day on earth.
Paul Simon has won 12 Grammy Awards, one of them a Lifetime Achievement Award, and 5 Album of the Year Grammy nominations. He is one of only 5 artists to have won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year more than once as the main credited artist. In 1998, he was entered in the Grammy Hall of Fame. He received an Oscar nomination for the song Father and Daughter. He is also a 2-time inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who in 2002 was honored as one of the 5 recipients of the annual Kennedy Center Honors, the nation's highest tribute to performing and cultural artists. In 2007, Simon received the first annual Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song. I've been speaking with Peter Ames Carlin, author of the new bio, Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon. For more information, visit peteramescarlin.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Peter Ames Carlin, author of Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon, and Pulitzer Prize nominee Winston Groom, of Forrest Gump fame, and author of El Paso, his first novel in 20 years. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. And we are back, and you were listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Life is a box of chocolates. It's one of the most memorable lines in cultural history. A play on an earlier line penned by the brilliant author Winston Groom in his iconic novel, Forrest Gump, a book that sold 1.7 million copies. As embodied by Tom Hanks on screen, Winston Groom's Forrest Gump is perhaps one of the most identifiable fictional characters of the last 30 years. Now, with El Paso, Groom makes a triumphant return to form with a swirling, unstoppable saga set against the panorama of the Mexican Revolution and its march into the American Southwest. Drawing brilliantly from Groom's award-winning nonfiction and inspired by a true story, El Paso begins at the turn of the 20th century with the Great War raging in Europe, the Mexican Civil War spilling over the border, and the titans of American industry, the Hearst, Whitneys, and Morgans, holding fast to their lands in northern Mexico. Among them is the fictional Shaughnessy family, with the Colonel at its helm, a Boston Railroad tycoon whose fading fortune is tied up in a colossal cattle ranch in Chihuahua. When the ranch is raided by the legendary Pancho Villa, the bull-headed colonel takes matters into his own hands. From there unfurls a rollicking work of historical fiction, combining Groom's talent for storytelling with rich, eminently memorable characters, some real, some imagined, in vintage Groom style, caught within the currents of a war storming through the Sierra Madre. Let's talk. So, Winston, boy, oh boy, oh boy. I mean, I am just, listen to me, savoring every word of El Paso. What a read. Really and truly, this is the truth. As the author of 20 previous books, including Forrest Gump, of course, and Conversations with the Enemy, for which you were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, right? Pretty cool. Was the past prelude for El Paso? Did you have to go through what you went through to be able to create this particular book?
Oh, not, they're all different. This is my first novel, like probably 20 years, I guess, maybe more, I don't know. And but it all sort of, once I actually sat down to do it all sort of fell together pretty quickly. It was a lot of fun to write.
It was a good one, huh? It was a good one.
Well, yeah, some books are tougher than others. I quit writing a lot of fiction. Well, I quit writing fiction sort of deliberately. So after Forrest Gump, I think that novelists, and I know a great many novelists, and the problem is that you're very, very fortunate if you have one or two good novels, but they keep writing, and they run out of ideas. It's not that they're bad writers; they're very good writers, but they just run out of ideas. And I ran out of ideas, and I sort of look back and you say, well, look what happened to Thomas Wolfe or Scott Fitzgerald. They drank themselves to death at an early age. Hemingway blew his brains out, and that was not a path that I particularly wanted to go down. And so I said, I know how to write history, and I like it, and I enjoy it, and so I did for a long time. But this book has sort of been simmering on the back burner for probably, again, about 20 years. I had a lot of stories that had been told to me by a friend whose family had a big spread down in northern Mexico during this period. But just a collection of stories doesn't really make it a novel. And so I had to really invent the characters and fit them all in together. And I finally sat down and did that a couple of years ago, and it worked.
It does work. It does work. It's really, really brilliant. So, something you said, are you a purist then? You are not going to set out to write a book unless you really know you have something to say, rather than I'm just going to pop a book out because that's what my publisher wants. That's commendable.
Well, it's not that I have something to say. I mean, I've always said, if you want a message, you call Western Union. Don't call me. But I don't like message books, but I do have to have a story to tell that I think it would be compelling to a reader. And otherwise, it just seems forced. And I think that you and the exceptions to every rule. Dickens, of course, comes to mind. He could write anything, anywhere, and turn it into a jewel. But sometimes, if you do 8 or 9 novels, or however many I did, and suddenly you just kind of run out of fresh ideas. And I knew that I loved to write, and writing history. I mean, the difference between writing history and a novel is history is always, you got a beginning and a middle and an end. In a novel, you sit down, you got a blank page in front of you, and
okay, that begs a question. Yeah, that begs a question then. So do you work off of an outline, or you just sit down one day and say, I got it all in, let's see what comes out?
Well, both. I tend to write an outline out just to get, from point A to point B every day. So here's what I like to cover. I sort of know how much I can write in a day that's really worthwhile. I mean, I could write 10 pages or 30 pages a day and only 5 of them being good, probably, if that many. And so I, after having done this for a while, I have my own little system. But again, it's all subject to change, because sometimes a story will seize you and take you someplace. Right. Although that's not the most effective way to write a novel, I don't think. I mean, you really need to be in control of it most of the time. But occasionally it will do that and just take you on a little sleigh ride.
Let's talk about Winston Groom. I want to talk about you, because I love your head. And I know I love your head because I love what you write. Listen to what I'm going to ask. I know that you grew up in the South. Talk to me about your childhood, your parents, your schooling, growing up in Mobile, Alabama. I got a good friend from Mobile, so I know Mobile well. The reason that I ask is because your work is so specific. I can pick up something that you write, particularly in the fiction, and I know it's you. There is just something that you got in there, and you must have gotten it from your childhood. Great storyteller. There are a lot of good writers. There are not always great storytellers. What in your childhood taught you about storytelling?
Well, I think that growing up in the South, just in general, the Southerners are storytellers. I mean, whether they're hunting and fishing tales or whatever. My mother she was rather unusual. She took a degree from the University of Alabama back in the 1920s, and then went on to get her master's degree and wrote her thesis on Shakespeare. And so she was a good storyteller, but she also she loved to take me to Shakespeare plays, and I remember going to the first Shakespearean movie I saw. I think was Macbeth with Orson Welles, and I knew the lines. And I was about 8 years old or something. So I think that was a part of it. And my dad was a lawyer, and they always got a lot of stories.
I was going to say.
I think it's. I think a lot of people have a lot of stories to tell. The older you get, the more stories you have.
But I'll tell you what you have. You have imagination, and the imagination shows up not just in your fiction. Even the way you tell a nonfiction book shows a certain imagination. And imagination, I don't know if that's something that you have or something you acquire. What do you think?
It's probably a little of both. I think that you can work on it, and the older you get, the more the clarity I think you have up to a certain point of thought, and I think it's the ability to see beyond the next hill is I guess the way I would express it. Just to know that something's going on over there, and to be able to visualize what it is and how to get your story from where you are into that whatever's going on over that hill.
When you were a kid in school,
on a daily basis.
Right. You went to military school. I don't know if you had the chance to do this, but when you were sitting in a classroom, were you able to look out the window and stare and go to town like I did as a kid and imagine? Or were you a kid whose head was in the books? Or what kind of kid was Winston?
Oh, I was probably pretty normal. I think.
Whatever that is.
In those days, you didn't get to do a lot of stargazing or navel gazing or whatever. They tried to get the material into you one way or the other. They had to beat it into you. But that was, I don't think when I was a senior, we had because it was a private school, they were not constrained by unions and stuff, and they were able to get young men for a year or two to come there and teach. For instance, when I was a senior, we had a guy who had just graduated. Well, not just graduated from Harvard, but he got his master's degree in, of all things, Shakespeare, just like my mother. So he was only about 23 years old. He wasn't much older than we were. And he had a way of teaching it to us that was just, it was meaningful. suddenly, because Shakespeare was just, was generally dull. He is dull, especially to somebody who's not really attuned to it. And this guy had, big old football jocks walking up and down the hall saying zounds and all these Shakespearean expressions. We really enjoyed the class. And I think then was when I began to realize that I had some talent in writing papers. We had to analyze poetry and analyze a short story here and there. And I began to realize that I was pretty good at it. And I sort of kept that up through college. And I wound up in college. I was the editor of the humor magazine, the college humor magazine. I thought I would be an editor, but I had to give up a couple of years of service to Uncle Sam in between then and when I graduated and by the time I got out to do something. And when I got through with that, I tried to go to New York and get a job as an editor, but everybody told me I didn't have the experience. Apparently, the college humor magazine didn't count so much. And so I finally remember asking Don Erickson, who was then the managing editor of Esquire, and he later became the editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine. But I remember asking him, I said, well, what do I have to do to get this experience? Because nobody will hire me to give me the experience. And he said, why don't you try working on a newspaper for a while? Maybe you. And I hadn't thought about that. And so anyway, I lucked into a job in Washington, at the Washington Star, and I spent almost 10 years there.
How did that prepare you, though? Now knowing, having researched you and knowing, the steps that you took to get where you got, I think you're a bit of an intellectual with a sense of humor, which is probably what made you the genius that you are, with that little Southern thing going on where you can tell a good yarn. Plus, you did work at the newspaper, and having been a reporter myself, I can tell you that's great. And Justice Department, I think, and federal court system, that'll teach anybody to be put a good A, B, C, D linear piece together. But then you went to NAM, and I know that you.
Well, I went there first.
Okay, but then I know that you said that up until then you weren't sure you had anything really substantive to write about. It's a hell of a thing to have to go to war, right, to learn how to get a good story going.
Well, yeah, that's one good thing about that war. It gave me a book.
But here's my question.
I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. I didn't want to spend. They by this point started paying us pretty well,
right,
at the paper, and I thought to myself, if I stay here much longer, I'm going to wind up with a house payment and a car payment, and this is what I'm going to do. And I just didn't really want to do that. And so I did probably the bravest thing I've ever done. I resigned, and I told them the reason. I said, I'm going to write a book. Because I basically knew at that point I'd burned all my bridges. If I failed, I would be too embarrassed to come back.
Oh, my gosh. And
so anyway, I left there, went to New York, and Washington's not a very good town for writing novels. I mean, it's a political town. And, I just wanted to change the scenery, and I wound up out in a place I'd never heard of before called the Hamptons, where my neighbors were such as Kurt Vonnegut and George Plimpton and Peter Madsen and James Jones and Bill Steyer and Willie Morris. I mean, it was every writer that you'd ever heard of lived out there just about. And they were very nice people. We all sort of informally, everybody get together at a restaurant called Bobby Van's in Bridgehampton for lunch. And it's funny, the writers don't talk about writing much. They talk about everything. They talk about baseball, talk about money. But everybody was very encouraging and want to know how the work was going. I said, it's going, how much you can say. I had gotten a book contract at that point with the Simon & Schuster, and so I was doing okay. And finally the book came out, and it was well received, and I was off and running.
That was Better Times Than These?
Yeah.
That was the first one. And what about Conversations with the Enemy? That's some story about POW Robert Russell Garwood, Pulitzer Prize for a General Nonfiction nomination, 1984. That's pretty cool, huh?
Well, it was a struggle. The subject wouldn't cooperate.
Oh, really?
Well, he found it very hard to cooperate. I abandoned that book a couple of times. I was asked to do this. It started off abortive almost from the beginning. I got a call from a friend of mine who was an editor at Simon & Schuster, not in my department, but a paperback editor. And she said, how would you like to write? You've been reading about this Garwood in the New York Times. And I said, I have, actually. It's sort of interesting. And he just returned from, I think, 14 years. He'd been a prisoner or whatever he was over there. And she said, well, I've got a couple of guys here who own the movie rights, and they want to get a paperback going and so forth. I said, well, I said, I really don't do that kind of thing. But I mentioned it to my literary agent a day or so later, and he just silenced on the end of the phone, and he said, I will call you back. And he called me back, and he said, well, those people don't own any rights to this guy. He said, they're basically selling a car that they don't own. He said, it's a typical Hollywood trick. They were trying to get the money to buy the rights from Garwood. And so anyway, it turned out my literary agent, he actually had been contacted by Garwood's lawyer and asked to represent him. And so he said, would you like to meet him? And I said, well, yeah. As I said, that really, again, was not my particular fort, but I said, I'll be glad. I met him at the Larchmont Yacht Club, of all places. Very fancy place up in Larchmont, New York. And we had lunch there with the lawyer and my agent and Mr. Garwood and myself. He wanted a hot dog, and we all had some kind of Waldorf salad.
I was going to say, at the Larchmont, a hot dog. It's a Waldorf salad kind of place.
That's what he got.
Yeah, really.
But I talked to him long enough to figure that he was probably the real thing, but he was so out of touch with everything. He had been, for 14 years, he was only 18 when he was captured, and he'd been put to all sorts of tortures and then sort of left to wither on the vine. And he had some stories to tell, but he was the Marines were trying him for treason. I'm sure he was nervous about that, and it was a struggle to do it. And I was at this point, I was living in New York, and most of his trial and everything were down in Virginia at the Marine Corps base. And that's when my friend Duncan Spencer stepped in. He was been a colleague of mine at the Washington Star, and he talked me into continuing it. And I said, I'll do it if you'll help me with it. And so he did.
And I'm going to cut you here because I have so much more I want to get to, but I just want to say this. Aren't you glad you did go with it and stay with it and see it through to the end?
I am.
Yeah, because, it's an extraordinary piece of work, and what a story. And if anybody can find that one out there, they should read it. Okay, Forrest Gump. Now, I would imagine you are sick and tired of talking about Forrest Gump on one hand, and on the other, how could you not just love Forrest Gump? Maybe I'm wrong. Am I wrong? Do you love Forrest and hate talking about it, or hate Forrest and love talking about it?
I remember John Knowles told me once, he was one of my neighbors out in New Hampton. He wrote a book called A Separate Peace.
Oh, my favorite when I was a kid.
It's my salvation and my millstone.
Exactly. And that's got to be tough for a writer and particularly something that went that gargantuan. Oh my God, right? You can never say Winston Groom and not say Forrest Gump in the same sentence. Were you prepared for how it changed your life? Can you ever be?
Well, it got to upgrade my brand of toilet paper. That's what you were driving at. But it wasn't anything that changed my... Well, it did, actually. A great deal of money descended on me all at once, which is nice. But I don't think it changed my life. It made it more comfortable.
To you, is that a story, or is that a political thesis? There's a lot of people who want to read a lot into it. Maybe it should be read into it. I want to know what you think. Did you write it with layers, or did you write it simply as a great yarn?
The latter.
Okay.
I wasn't, as I said, if you want a message, you call Western Union.
Okay.
I remember what happened after, it was a big follow-on when the movie came out.
Right.
And because we were selling G and books and everything. But then the political people got it. And I remember then that all they had on was those people that argued on, what was it, CNN. They had an arguing contest about 5 o'clock every afternoon with Pat, somebody. And the 2 or 3 of them, one was a conservative, one's a liberal, and one was in the middle. But they all got to arguing about it all the time. I couldn't turn on television without hearing these arguments. And then they started writing the editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I remember somebody called me about it once, and it was some psychiatrist, I don't know. The headline on the story was an op-ed piece of Forrest Gump, National Folk Zero. And it said that he was a terrible example to people because he didn't do anything on his own. Everything fell in his lap. And it went on. I said, the hell with this. And I left and went up to the mountains of North Carolina where nobody could reach me on the phone.
Really?
And I stayed up there for about 5 months until it all blew over. But it did become sort of a political football for a while. And I had no idea that anybody was reading all that stuff into it.
Well, it's an extraordinary piece of work, and whether you meant it to have layers or you didn't, it does. But that being said, I'm curious about this. Who was Forrest Gump? Was he a composite character? Was he you?
Nah,
not you. None of you in it.
Well, he's an idiot for crying out loud.
Yeah, but idiots can be smarter than other people.
Yeah, I'd say that the way that happened was I was in New York still, and I was coming home in the wintertime for sometimes 3 or 4 weeks to see my father, who was quite old then. And I would take him to lunch, and he one time began to reminisce about growing up, and he was born in 1906, so you get the picture there. He grew up in Mobile, and he was reminiscing about this young man in his neighborhood who was what they then call retarded, and the kids would chase him and tease him and throw sticks at him and so forth. And about then, his mother, the young man's mother, bought a piano, and the kids watched it being taken into the home. And next thing you know, these gorgeous piano music came wafting out of it. And so they decided they were going to take him under their wing, that they were going to protect him. And I had just seen 60 Minutes came out right around then with a piece on the idiot savant syndrome, which is essentially where you have a person who can't tie their own shoelaces, but they can perform really dexterous mental exercises such as mathematics and musical things. And that evening I said, I'm going to make some notes on this before I forget it, because maybe I can use it as a scene somewhere in a book. And by late that evening, I had finished the first chapter of Forrest Gump.
Wow.
And that's the way it happened. And
wow.
It's not based on anybody. It was one of those books that literally wrote itself. And I had not had that happen before, and I don't think it'll ever happen again. I remember Joe Heller told me one time that Catch-22 wrote itself, but I'm not even sure I believe that. But this one was such I didn't have an outline, didn't have anything.
The muses.
I just sit there and say, what you going to do today?
You got the muses coming talking to you, Mr. Groom. Listen also on this, because I think it's important. In that book, I think you had him meeting real people. It's kind of a theme also in El Paso, where historical characters cross paths with the. Was that something that you thought about, or that just happened and you realized how much fun that could be to incorporate the real?
More the latter. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was something that I think if you can drop some historical characters, I don't know what kind of book you're doing, but I did it in El Paso. I put some real people in there, or historical figures. Just most of them as cameos, but some of them I left in because they worked well in the story. But I did the same thing. It propelled the plot along in Forrest. To have him meet people, and I thought it was an interesting play on how a person of his mentality would view the events of his day, and it seemed to work.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I was trying to assess that when as I was reading El Paso, and I think what happens is it actually makes the fiction characters more real. It aids and abets them. Do you understand?
Yeah, well, the ones in El Paso, they're the main characters, really. Everybody else is sort of a foil, but they're good foils. I mean, they make some sense, and they sort of take away from if you don't have anything particularly interesting to say about the good characters, you can get rid of the foils and let them do something. And I think the same thing was true about Forrest Gump. But some of that stuff in Gump was I thought it was interesting. The chess game. I don't know if that wasn't in the movie. I don't think. But there were other things. I had him go into outer space with a female orangutan. And a lot of stuff they couldn't put in the movie because Forrest Gump is essentially a farce. And Americans, I don't think, do farce very well. They do it at the Groucho Marx level.
Slapstick, more slapstick than farce, right? Yeah.
The French can do farce. French are very good at farce, but we don't get it. We don't take it very well. There's some things like Dr. Strangelove that, but I just the movie people don't really they don't get it. They're scared of it because it's either going to be if it's not good, it's going to fall flat on its face. There's no in between.
You didn't have a good time with Hollywood, by the way, on Forrest Gump. You got kind of screwed. Did I read that? Is that correct? I mean, on the film and money.
Well, I don't know where you read it. There's so many stories out there. Most of them are wrong.
Okay.
They got me suing Paramount. It never happened. What happens is, and it happens in almost all cases where the movie company is a standard contract, whether it's Warner Brothers or Paramount or something, and it gives the author or the producer or whatever certain points, either gross points or net points. And net points is funny money. I mean, net points is money after profits. And the way they arrange it, they've been doing this since early 1900s. They've learned how to do all this. So the movie's very rarely going to make a net profit. And so anyway, I remember getting a call one day from Art Buchwald.
Wow, I remember him? Yeah.
Humorous column for the Washington Post, and he said, I just saw come across an AP wire that Forrest Gump has not made any money. This is about a year after the film came out. Do you mind if I write a story about it? And I said, no, go ahead. I was down in Naples, Florida, of all places, making a speech. And the next thing you know, I came back and I got all these calls from Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and everybody. He'd done this story because, of course, he had an axe to grind with Paramount, too. He had to sue him over with that Eddie Murphy movie. And anyway, he did his column appeared probably 600-700 papers, so it became a big deal. And again, I left. I said, I'm not talking to anybody. I'm going bird hunting. And so after a while, got the attention of the people at Paramount who very nicely, basically what they had to do was rewrite our contracts. Those people who had net points, and they rewrote them so we got what they call producers points, which is a lot better than the net points.
So listen, El Paso.
That's the short version.
That's the short version. El Paso would make a great film. It really would. Would you do it? Would you go back to Hollywood, or would you say, I'm not getting going?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? You'd go there in a heartbeat?
My theory about all that is I write books, and I'm pretty good at it. And they make movies, and they're pretty good at that. And I don't really want to get involved much, although I never say never, but with scripts and things or stuff. But I mean, I never turn down money unless it's something attached to it that I really don't want to fool with. But I think it could be a good movie. It would be an expensive movie probably because it's essentially a costume drama, and you got a lot of animals and people and so forth. But they haven't made a movie like that in quite a while, and I think it'd be great for. You never can tell. I've got projects out there now under contract, option. I mean, it's like having an annuity.
You never know, right?
The more they option the thing, the deeper they get, and they got optioned again.
Right. So, real, I hear you. So listen, Winston, I have to wrap up, and I feel bad because I have 1,000 more questions I'd love to ask you, but I want to talk to you about this. There aren't a lot of writers left who write great stories as you do. That's the truth. The James Mitchners, the Herman Woukes, the great epic novels. We used to have a lot of them. We have few now, and thank God for El Paso.
No, they don't. And
it's a shame. It's a shame. So let me say what I wanted to say. Nonfiction these days seems to sell better than fiction. Reality TV sells better than episodic TV. And these days, when fiction sells, it's often the macabre, the fantasy, all that kind of crazy stuff. And I want to, you're 74 years young, you've lived? You've had quite a life. You've had a lot of ups, a lot of downs probably. But I want to ask you this, and that's about America's imagination. Are we too cynical to fully appreciate a really good old-fashioned yarn like El Paso, 500-page plus? Or is it that there are few great writers of long-form fiction, and that's why we don't have any? And thank you for this book, because I finally have something to sink my teeth into. I've been looking for this book for a long time. Talk to me about that as we close. What are your theories?
I think it's a little of both. And I think that, and there's another thing I'd sort of throw in the mix, and I hate to, this maybe make me sound cynical. I think it's these writing schools, where people go get some kind of degree in writing. And I don't know what they haven't lived a life yet. I don't really have any experience. And so what you've got in so many of these novels today is sort of introverted, self-absorbed, it's a personality cult kind of thing. They write about themselves. And that's one thing I learned not to do. And who was it? Jim Jones told me that. He wrote From Here to Eternity. And Jim, well, I was discussing it with him one time. And right when I started to write Better Times Than These, he said, well, whoever your main character is, you might want to think about making him as different from yourself as you possibly can. Because there'll be enough of you in there. But you don't want to make him too much like you, because then when it comes to time he has to do something that you wouldn't do, you're going to be in a fix. And I did that. And I think that I don't know what to make of fiction anymore. You know, I was looking at the Wall Street Journal the other day. They put out a weekly book list, book sales list. And they had the top 10 novels, top 10 fiction books. Every one of them was a child's book. Every single one.
Unbelievable.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Now that probably accounts because it, getting up on Christmas and stuff like that. But there just not that many novelists left. All the ones that I just named, every name I could drop, some too famous to drop, they're all gone now.
Yeah, it's.
I go to New York. I don't have anybody call up. Gates Elise.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Like that. I mean, everybody else has passed on.
I think, I think something that what you just said struck me, and about the difference between your work and other people's work. You work from the heart, and a good storyteller works from the heart. And what's happening today is everybody's over-intellectualizing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know what they're teaching in schools now. When I don't know at schools.
Yeah, I was going to say, how about society? Maybe that's just society these days, too.
Well, when I was coming up, Faulkner and Fitzgerald and Hemingway were the three heavy hitters. If you got a degree in English, which I did, you had to pass through a course in one of those, or all three of them, or actually Henry James or something. All these were terrific storytellers, and I don't know what they're teaching these days. Be interesting to find out.
All I can tell you is thank you for El Paso. We needed it.
Well, thank you. El Paso was a lot of fun.
It's
invented ways to kill people. It was very dangerous times out there.
There sure were, and it's also very timely. I'm thinking that too with the railroad barons. Where it's the elite. It's kind of like full circle. Here we are. I've been speaking with Winston Groom, whose latest work of fiction is El Paso, by way of Liverite Publishing Corporation, a division of W.W. Norton & Company. For more information on El Paso and Winston Groom, visit winstongroom.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. Associate producer, Suzanne Probst. Music by Tony Rosales Jazz. Visit HalliCasserJayne.com.